We tend to begin human history after the waters recede. The familiar timeline starts with the first farms, the first temples, the first cities whose stones still rise above the ground. Yet behind that neat beginning stands a shadowed boundary, ancient flood stories found on every continent, told in different languages, wrapped in different gods and heroes, but often echoing the same unsettling idea: that the world we inherited was not the first world. That something older was lost, not to fire or war, but to water. Modern coastlines feel permanent. We draw borders along shores, build ports, and mark sea levels as if they are a stable frame around the human story. But according to geological evidence, the coasts we know are only a recent addition of the planet's surface. During the last ice age, immense volumes of water were locked into continental glaciers. Sea levels were far lower than they are today, exposing wide plains where waves now roll, and creating long corridors of habitable land along the edges of continents. Where there is coastline today, there was once open country, with rivers, lakes, and fertile flats. If people lived there, their world would now be invisible from the beach. It would be drowned not by myth, but by physics. At the end of the Ice Age, the planet warmed. Ice sheets that had endured for thousands of years began to collapse, and the oceans rose as meltwater returned to the sea. This was not a single moment, but it was not always slow. Some researchers suggest that sea level rise came in pulses, with periods of rapid change that could transform coastlines within human lifetimes. Even a rise of a few meters can redraw an entire region. It pushes salt water into deltas, erases beaches, floods estuaries, and converts valleys into bays. It forces people to move, first uphill, then inland, then away from places that had anchored their lives for generations. When the water advances, it does not announce itself as a singular catastrophe. It arrives in increments: storm tides that reach farther, wells that turn brackish, fields that refuse to dry, familiar paths that disappear under marsh. Yet those increments accumulate into a turning point, and in the end, the sea claims what it always wanted: the lowlands. If there were coastal settlements in those exposed Ice Age landscapes, they would have been among the first to vanish. Not necessarily because they were less advanced, but because they were built in the places most vulnerable to the planet's shifting boundaries. From this perspective, the question is not whether land was lost. That is certain. The question is what, if anything, was built on that lost land, and whether traces remain. Along coastlines around the world, divers and researchers have reported underwater formations that appear unexpectedly geometric: lines of stone that resemble walls, platforms that look like terraces, blocks arranged in ways that seem deliberate. Some sites are famous, photographed, and debated for decades. Others exist as local stories told by fishermen, or as brief reports in the margins of scientific literature. In several cases, natural explanations are offered first, and often rightly so. The sea can fracture rock into sharp angles. Waves can stack boulders into ridges. Geological bedding planes can form steps. In a world of complex erosion, nature produces illusions that resemble architecture. And yet, some submerged sites remain stubbornly difficult to dismiss. There are places where stones appear shaped or positioned in patterns that repeat. Places where the scale seems human, not random. Places where features look like they belong to a shoreline world, not a deep marine environment. The debate itself reveals something important. Even when claims are overstated, the underlying reality is that the seafloor near coasts is full of surprises, and it is vastly less explored than the land. Underwater archaeology exists, but it is limited by cost, technology, visibility, and time. The ocean hides evidence not only with depth, but with complexity. It is possible that some underwater ruins are misread geology, and that some are genuine traces of human work. The challenge is that both can be true at once, and distinguishing between them requires patient surveying, careful dating, and a willingness to accept uncertain results. In shallow waters, even a few centuries can transform a structure. Over thousands of years, the transformation becomes absolute. The sea does not preserve buildings the way deserts do, it dismantles them. If ancient coasts hosted towns, ports, and trade centers, we should imagine them not as legendary marble cities, waiting intact beneath clear water, but as places that would be broken apart, scattered, buried, and colonized by marine life. Wood becomes food, metal corrodes, stone becomes substrate for coral and algae. Sand moves like a slow, persistent weather system. A single storm can shift sediments enough to cover or expose entire walls. Over centuries, seabed landscapes migrate. Over millennia, they forget. Even so, the possibility of drowned coastlines has drawn attention to another puzzle: old maps that seem to show lands that do not match modern shorelines. Some early charts depict coastlines with strange extensions, islands that are absent today, or shapes that invite the imagination to fill the gaps. It is easy to romanticize these maps as secret knowledge, but it is also easy to dismiss them as errors, guesses, or artistic flourishes. The truth is usually less dramatic and more interesting. Ancient and early modern mapmakers worked with incomplete information. They compiled reports from sailors, merchants, and travelers. They copied earlier maps, sometimes preserving mistakes, sometimes preserving data whose original meaning was lost. They filled blank spaces with patterns, monsters, or conjecture. And yet, it is possible that certain geographic memories persisted longer than we assume. Shorelines changed slowly enough that oral traditions can preserve a sense of former landscapes, where an inlet used to be, where a sandbar once connected an island, where a river mouth shifted, where a bay opened to the sea. If ancient accounts reflect real events, then a map showing an unusual coastline could, in some cases, echo an older reality, filtered through generations of retelling and reinterpretation. Not a perfect snapshot of an Ice Age world, but a whisper, a distortion. A hint that humans once navigated different waters and remembered different land. This brings us to the most enduring and universal evidence of all: the stories. Flood myths are often treated as cultural metaphors or theological lessons, and they are that. But their global distribution is difficult to ignore. From Mesopotamian narratives to stories of deluges in South Asia, from indigenous traditions in the Americas to island cultures across the Pacific, many societies preserved accounts of overwhelming water, sudden destruction, and a small remnant of survivors who carried life into a changed world. The similarities do not prove a single global flood in the literal sense. They do not require one date, one boat, one mountain. Human imagination is capable of producing similar stories for similar reasons. Flooding is among the most terrifying natural forces, and communities living near rivers and coasts will always face it. But some researchers suggest that the clustering of these myths around themes of moral reset, lost knowledge, and a before world may point to something deeper: cultural memory of major environmental change near the end of the last ice age, when shorelines shifted and familiar lands disappeared. Imagine what a rapid rise in sea level would look like to a coastal people without modern instruments. The sea would not be a number. It would be a living boundary that crossed sacred places, burial grounds, homes, and fields. It would swallow landmarks that defined identity. It would turn navigable routes into open water, and it would force migrations that broke the continuity of generations. In such a world, a story of a great flood is not just plausible. It is almost inevitable. Now consider what else might be lost when the coast is lost. Coastal settlements are not only places of fishing and trade, they are crossroads. They are archives of contact, where goods, ideas, and techniques move between groups. Ports concentrate knowledge, navigation, seasonal wines, currents, shipbuilding, astronomy, and measurement. A community that survives by reading the sea learns patterns that can be turned into calendars, routes, and maps. If such centers disappeared, if harbors drowned, fleets were destroyed, and the people who held the knowledge were scattered or killed, the loss would not be limited to buildings. It would include the invisible infrastructure of understanding. The sudden loss of coastal centers could create a paradox that we still struggle to interpret: a world where human populations persist, yet certain kinds of sophistication appear to start over. Trade networks collapse, craft traditions fragment. Navigation becomes local rather than regional. Surviving inland populations and refugees moving uphill would retain only fragments, a few stories, a few symbols, a few practical skills, and memories reshaped by grief and distance. It is possible that later civilizations, rising on new shorelines or river valleys, were not born from nothing, but from survivors adapting to a reduced world. This does not require an advanced global civilization with impossible technology. It requires only that some groups had developed complex coastal lifeways, specialized knowledge, regional trade, durable stonework in certain places, and that a major environmental shift erased the setting that supported them. In that scenario, rebuilding after the flood becomes not a mythic restart, but a human pattern, continuity mixed with rupture. Archaeology on land often finds what endures: stone foundations, fired clay, bones, and tools. But if earlier settlements were concentrated on coasts now underwater, then a great portion of the evidence would be missing by default. We would build our models from what remains, and what remains would be biased toward inland, toward caves and uplands, toward regions spared by the sea. The absence of evidence would quietly become evidence of absence, not because nothing existed, but because the archive was relocated to the seafloor. This is one reason the idea is often ignored or treated as fringe. Underwater archaeology is difficult, expensive, and limited. Visibility can be poor, currents can be dangerous. Permissions are complex, survey equipment costs more than many research budgets can support. Excavation underwater is slower and more delicate than excavation on land, and conservation of recovered materials is challenging. Even finding a site is hard because the ocean is vast and because likely ancient coastlines are now hidden beneath layers of sediment. Historical models also tend to follow the evidence we can touch. A shovel in the ground is simpler than a remotely operated vehicle at depth. Land-based archaeology has built an extraordinary picture of the past, and it deserves its authority. But it also creates a kind of gravitational pull. We study what we can reach, and then we assume what we cannot reach matters less. What lies beneath the ocean often remains outside the main conversation, not because it is unimportant, but because it is inconvenient. And yet, the planet's geography insists on a broader view. The oceans cover most of Earth. They border every continent, shaping climate, food, migration, and imagination. If human communities lived along ancient shorelines when sea levels were far lower, then entire chapters of prehistory may be physically submerged. Not erased in the sense of being completely gone, but hidden behind the immense difficulty of searching underwater landscapes that have been reworked by waves, sand, and time. According to geological evidence, the seafloor near modern coasts contains drowned river channels, submerged deltas, and ancient shorelines features that can be mapped, dated, and traced. These are not mythic, they are measurable. And where there were rivers and deltas, there were resources, fish, freshwater, plants, animals, travel routes. Those are the magnets that pull human settlement. It would be strange if no one lived there. The more precise question is what form those lives took, and whether any of their works can still be distinguished from the geology that surrounds them. Some researchers suggest that the future of this inquiry will look less like treasure hunting and more like landscape archaeology on a submerged planet. Wide area sonar surveys, careful sampling, comparison of stone features with known natural processes, dating of sediments that bury or expose structures. A slow accumulation of evidence where each site must be treated as a hypothesis rather than a certainty. It is possible that many claims will fail and that the most intriguing sites will turn out to be natural. But it is also possible that a small number will endure scrutiny and that they will quietly shift our sense of where early complexity could have lived. In the end, the most unsettling thought is not that a lost world waits intact beneath the waves, but that the ocean is the perfect editor. It does not preserve the past in readable form, it transforms it. It makes certainty rare and ambiguity common. It replaces straight lines with broken ones, and it replaces human meanings with reef and silt. Still, the silence of the sea is not proof that nothing happened. It may be the opposite. It may be the consequence of too much time, too much motion, and too much water. If there were early coastal cities, whether modest trading towns or larger centers of regional power, then their disappearance would not necessarily leave a clear scar. It would leave gaps in our story, places where the narrative feels abruptly new, where knowledge seems to restart, where myths appear like smoke from a fire we cannot see. And perhaps that is why flood stories endure. Not as literal history, and not as pure invention, but as cultural sediment. A way of carrying the memory of change across thousands of years when the landscape itself has moved. If ancient accounts reflect real events, they may not be describing one impossible global deluge. They may be describing something more realistic and more haunting, a world in which the familiar edges of the continents were not fixed, and in which people watched the sea take their homes. The oceans cover most of the planet, and they are older than our species. They hold shipwrecks, yes, but they also hold coastlines that no longer exist, and perhaps the traces of communities that once thrived where our maps now show only water. If early civilizations lived along those ancient shores, their cities would lie in silence beneath the waves, not preserved as monuments, but scattered as fragments, waiting for instruments patient enough to read them. The past may not be missing, it may simply be submerged. And when we stand at the edge of the sea, looking out over water that seems eternal, it is worth remembering that this surface is not only a boundary. It is a cover. Beneath it may lie landscapes that once carried footsteps, voices, trade, and memory. Not a fantasy, not a certainty, but a possibility grounded in the restless history of Earth itself. The ocean does not speak, but it keeps its own archive. And our understanding of human beginnings may depend on whether we learn how to listen to what the water has hidden.